Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am joined by a scholar, a professor, and an author of a really interesting new book about film. And I'm very excited to bring it to you all, so let's get into it. Welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Of course, thanks so much, Jen. My name's Philip Kaisary. I'm the author of From Havana to Hollywood, Slave Resistance in the Cinematic Imaginary, and I'm a professor at Carleton University in Ottawa in Canada.
Could you tell us a little bit about what led you to this project, about your career and your research? I know that you sort of sit at the nexus of several very interesting departments. Could you talk about what brought you to this book?
Yeah, sure. So in some ways, this book was kind of 20 years in the making, or 21, 22 years in the making even. So as an undergraduate, I studied English literature at Edinburgh University in Scotland. And then I knew I wanted to go to graduate school. And I applied to do a master's in post-colonial studies, a sort of subfield of English literature, or a subfield that grew up in English departments. And I did that at Sussex University, also in the UK. And it was in that year, so this is now way back in 2002, 2003, I was introduced to the films of Gillo Pontecorvo. That was the year I saw the Battle of Algiers for the first time, which made a massive impact on me as, someone in their early 20s. And it's regarded as maybe the greatest anti-colonial film of all time. And then I also watched Gillo Pontecorvo's Burn or Quemada, which is much less well received, not nearly as well known as the Battle of Algiers. And sort of lots of critics thought that Burn was sort of one of Pontecorvo's lesser films. And I watched this film, and it's a film about a fictionalized slave revolution in the Caribbean. The way the film is made, it sort of forces comparison with the Haitian Revolution, which is mentioned a few times in the film. It stars Marlon Brando, and he plays a sort of a British imperialist sort of scoundrel. Anyway, without getting into the weeds of the film, I was just struck by it. It was like nothing I had ever seen up to that point in my life. And at the same time as sort of being exposed to Gillo Pontecorvo's films, I was also reading a lot of Black history. I read C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins for the first time that year, which is sort of, the classic account of the Haitian slave revolution, the revolution that led to the founding of Haiti in 1804. And then what else? I read Frantz Fanon, the Afro-Caribbean sort of radical activist, a psychiatrist, someone who wrote He's most known for two books. One is called Black Skin, White Masks, which was actually a kind of a master's thesis, basically, which is pretty extraordinary. And then he wrote the book that became regarded as the sort of the Bible of third worldism, if you like, which is called The Wretched of the Earth. And so all of this stuff was sort of, I was exposed to all of this stuff. I was tremendously excited. And yeah, I knew I wanted, so what I'm trying to say is that I knew I wanted to write about Burn. It seemed like I sort of thought that the little that had been written on it didn't get that film right, and it's a film that's still, it was always in circulation even to this day. It comes up every now and then in art house movie theaters around the world. It's available online on YouTube, and it sort of circulates, and it always has. And it's a sort of a super interesting film that flies under the radar. But basically, I didn't really know. I wasn't sure what my angle on it, what my kind of way in was going to be. So So basically I didn't write about Byrne until this book, sort of 20 years later, 20 odd years later. But like another kind of important moment in this book's prehistory was 2013 when Steve McQueen's 12 Years a Slave came out. So by that time, I long since finished my master's degree. I had gone on to doctoral studies. I wrote my PhD on the literary impact of the Haitian Revolution, and it was right around the time that 12 Years a Slave came out that my first book, which was called, what was it called? The Haitian Revolution in the Literary Imaginary. And that was a book that was about 20th century sort of literary reimaginings of the Haitian Revolution. And I was particularly interested in sort of literary writings by Afro-Caribbean, African-American, and Black British writers who were all in various ways seeking to contest the kind of the long derogatory history that's been told about Haiti. And the Haitian Revolution gets a really bad rap, and it has done from the beginning. And it's associated, Haiti is associated with what, in the mainstream, in the global north, with like, poverty, disaster, political corruption, voodoo, black magic, a whole bunch of bad stuff, basically. And I was interested in sort of literary writings about the revolution that were trying to sort of explore the less told version of the story. And so I was doing work in that vein. And McQueen's 12 Years a Slave comes out. So obviously I'm working on, Black history and culture. And 12 Years a Slave really took the film world by storm in Britain, in the US, globally. And it was, famously the first Hollywood adaptation of a slave narrative. And so I went to go and see it in a North London multiplex. I was still living in the UK at the time. And I kind of had a similar but also very different response to watching that film that I had to watching Byrne. I came away from seeing that movie and thinking, okay, I've got stuff to say about this film. And I felt like for very different reasons, I thought the critics were misreading 12 Years a Slave in, important, interesting ways. So 12 Years a Slave. So in fact, then I did like write an academic article about 12 Years a Slave. What I basically did is I compared it to Solomon Northup's original narrative. And the nub of the argument was really, hey, look at the film and read the narrative, and then notice what I'd call the systematic pattern of additions and omissions in the film versus the narrative. And I sort of asked the question, of like, what does this amount to? Of what is this an instance? And essentially, the kind of the key omission, in my view, was really the fact that Solomon Northup's accounts of Black resistance or resistance to the institution of slavery undertaken by enslaved peoples really gets written out of the movie script and the movie. And so, yeah, so that happened, but I'm still not writing this book yet by this time. And then, so I guess the third and final sort of significant sort of moment in this book's prehistory was the academic year of 2015, 2016. So I was enormously sort of, fortunate. I had the good fortune to go and spend the year at Vanderbilt University as a Fulbright scholar. And when I was there, I got chatting to a wonderful historian of Black history, a man called Richard Blackett. And he was interested in my take on 12 Years a Slave. And he sort of like asks me, I think we were having coffee at the time or something. But he said a couple of things. First of all, he said that, the journal that I published my essay on 12 Years a Slave, which is called MELUS, which stands for the, can I even remember the acronym? The sort of I don't think this is embarrassing. I can't remember the acronym. But anyway, he said the acronym sounds like cough medication, MELUS. Like, this is not going to be read by the millions. But anyway, but he said, nevertheless, like he was interested in my take on the film. And he sort of casually said, hey, have you ever watched this Cuban film from the 70s about slavery? It's called El Otro Francisco, The Other Francisco. And I'd never heard of it. And he said, well, you might be interested in checking it out. It provides a really different perspective compared to 12 Years a Slave. And so off I went to the Vanderbilt Library, and I sort of, I found they had a VHS cassette copy in their Audiovisual Resources Center, and I watched it, and I was awestruck. A film made on a shoestring budget that tells a dramatically different story of slavery and abolition to the one that we're used to hearing in the US and Canada and Europe. So yeah, and so that was kind of the beginning of like this rabbit hole that I went into that was Cuban film. And I discovered there, it was that year that I discovered that there is this sort of, rich tradition of Cuban filmmaking that has addressed the subject of slavery. And I was sort of struck from the outset at how different the Cuban filmic tradition was versus the sort of the Hollywood tradition, if you like. And so then basically at that point, the book's basic structure started to take shape. It was like, compare and contrast, to put it sort of crudely, these two filmic traditions and try and kind of think through, of what the differences are an instance, how can we explain them, and which tradition does a better job, which tradition does a better job of communicating something about the history of slavery. So hopefully that's not too long-winded an answer, but that's sort of the story of the book's prehistory.
Wow. Yeah, that's a fascinating journey, and I'm really interested in sort of the order in which you came to the movies and how your argument developed. Yeah, I love that answer because it also provided sort of an overview of the sort of tradition of depicting slavery in film, which your intro does really, really comprehensively and efficiently. Let's see. Oh, yes, I would love if we could talk a little bit more about Burn, because as I was reading your book, after I finished it, I watched this film, and it is really fascinating. It's a really complex movie. There is no heroic protagonist at all. Like it's very a very stark, complicated, nuanced movie. Yeah, could you talk a little bit about what makes it so unique and what is unique about its perspective? I was particularly interested in the fact that it pairs Marlon Brando with a literally unknown actor who was just sort of who had never acted before, if I understand correctly,
Yeah.
right? It's a fascinating combination. So yeah, could you talk a little bit more about that and how it sort of either undermines or stands in contrast to the Hollywood narrative?
That's a great question. So yeah, I share your kind of fascination for Burn. So so as I say, before Gillo Pontecorvo made Burn, he had made the Battle of Algiers, which had been a sensation. And so it kind of turned Gillo Pontecorvo into, a household name. So Pontecorvo, the background you need to know on Pontecorvo was his personal history is fascinating. So he's Italian from an assimilated Jewish family. He played a truly important role in World War II in organizing resistance. He's crossing in between Italy and France. He's a communist. And Pontecorvo, in an interview that he gave, he said, I can only paraphrase it, I can't remember it word for word, but he essentially said that, the history of colonialism and anti-colonialism is like the story of my generation. It's sort of like the thing that for Pontecorvo that it's the inescapable, unavoidable background to the world, and it sort of conditions his worldview. And so he makes obviously this film, The Battle of Algiers, about the Algerian War of Independence. And so, and the other thing to say about Pontecorvo is he was basically a semi-professional tennis player. So he has a kind of like he has a like a mini tennis career before he then becomes a filmmaker. And he only becomes a filmmaker after, I think, giving up on a career as a musician, a composer. He has this very serious interest in music. But anyway, he after the Battle of Algiers, he's like someone that the Hollywood studios are kind of willing to take a chance on. His politics are pretty unattractive to them. United Artists who made or financed Burn were not especially enamored with Pontecorvo's politics, of course, but what they were tempted by was the idea that he could make this kind of big, epic blockbuster movie that's and if you think about it, the history of a slave revolution it's got enormous cinematic potential, which, just as an aside, sort of speaks to like the remarkable absence of a major Hollywood movie about the Haitian Revolution. I mean, there's a film that's waiting to be made. And in fact, there are many people who have been trying to make that film. Sergio Eisenstein tried to make a film about the Haitian Revolution. Richard Wright, the African-American novelist, and most recently Danny Glover. Danny Glover, who he's been. I remember reading a really interesting newspaper story in which Danny Glover is sort of talking about how difficult it has been in the 21st century to kind of make a movie about the Haitian Revolution, and he basically describes walking into meetings with people who are, interested in financing Hollywood movies. And Danny Glover says the question he gets asked is, where are the white heroes? Like, where are the white heroes in this movie? And absent white heroes, I think it's just much more difficult to make a big Hollywood blockbuster, basically. So anyway, so this is like, the late 60s. Burn eventually comes out in 1969, and he's actually got the backing of a major Hollywood studio to make this film. And the production history is so interesting because Pontecorvo has to navigate all kinds of things and make all kinds of compromises. So United Artists didn't want Pontecorvo to make this film in black and white, unsurprisingly. The Battle of Algiers had been filmed in black and white, and Gillo Pontecorvo said, "Okay, fine, we'll do it in color." But we're going to, but there were certain things he didn't want to compromise on. He was not going to compromise on, for example, his choice of actors. As you say, the two big actors who play the two main characters in the movie, Marlon Brando plays Sir William Walker, and Evaristo Marquez, who is an Afro-Colombian herdsman, with and the story goes that Evaristo Marquez had not so much as seen a film, let alone acted in one, by the time that Pontecorvo casts him. Pontecorvo had always in his career used non-professional actors. And it was something he was not going to compromise on. And so he insists on Evaristo Marquez, who I think gives this extraordinary performance. And he said, I think the screen test was, it was reckless. And Pontecorvo admitted it later. He said, I basically cast Marquez, he says, on the basis of a 30-second screen test or something. I just saw his face and knew this was the guy. He had to play Jose Dolores. Jose Dolores is a sort of the heroic Black revolutionary figure who sort of duels with Brando's Sir William Walker throughout the film. And I guess another thing to think about or to be aware of is that one of the things that Pontecorvo does in pitting Brando against or alongside Evaristo Marquez is it kind of like messes with the spectator's kind of reading of the film, because you've got this Hollywood star, Marlon Brando, and you sort of, but without, giving it all away, Sir William Walker is like this a profoundly problematic character. He's initially sent to Quemada to actually instigate a black revolution. He's being he's in the British basically are paying him to kind of manufacture a revolution so that the Portuguese colonizers get overthrown, which will then open up the Quemada's sugar to the British market. And so he's kind of an imperialist, kind of like cad or scoundrel, a gun for hire. And Marquez is the much more sympathetic character. And so one of the things that's going on is that Pontecorvo's kind of messing with the viewer's sort of need for a kind of a big name actor, someone they think they know and seems familiar, to sort of, to be the focus of their sort of spectatorial fascination, if you like. And so and actually, I think the way in which Pontecorvo kind of uses these two characters, and Brando and Marquez, is actually he kind of lays a trap for the viewer. Because initially, you side with Brando, even though he's, up to no good. He's this incredibly charismatic, compelling guy, very smart, sort of, a super free intellectual, talking, he talks a good talk, basically. But then in the second half of the film, when Brando's character pursues, a genocidal war of extermination against the local population. As a viewer, your sort of previous sort of sympathy and interest in Brando is kind of profoundly sort of complicated. And Marquez kind of wins the day. Marquez does, spoiler alert, Marquez doesn't Marquez's character doesn't survive to see a successful revolution in Quemada. Nor does Brando's character, actually. Brando's character is also killed. But anyway, it's a fascinating film in so many levels. And then I suppose just very briefly, a couple of things to note about the making of it. So Pontecorvo and Brando, two stubborn perfectionists. I think that the story goes they were at each other's throats throughout the making. They were driving each other just kind of bananas. And then Brando is quoted as saying, Evaristo Marquez's extraordinary development as an actor in a very short time during the filming would have sent Stanislavski spinning in his grave, I think is what Brando says. So anyway, it's just a very, very unusual film. It's like a renegade Hollywood movie. And then I guess just another thing to note is that United Artists really got cold feet about it towards the end. They did a screen test, and basically, I think what happened is they got very negative feedback from the sort of pre-release screen tests, and they were worried that people wouldn't understand it. It's a kind of fairly intricate political plot. And so they kind of imposed about 20-30 minutes of cuts on Pontecorvo. They insisted on originally, the colonizers in Quemada were supposed to be Spanish, but United Artists were worried about a backlash from Franco's Spain, and so they told Pontecorvo, right, the colonizers have to be Portuguese. I mean, it's all very ironic, of course, because like the real villains in the movie are the Brits. The British come out, truly badly, and Yeah, and it's really just very different compared to the sort of the Hollywood tradition of, slavery flips. Movies about slavery have, conspicuously avoided the subjects of Black revolution, Black agency, and instead, we're probably much more familiar with the tradition that we can trace back to, say, Gone with the Wind. Sort of, the sort of where the central characters are white. Very often the Hollywood films about slavery have either subtly or not so subtly sought to sort of defend a sort of the myth of the lost cause, and and so anyway, so the burn is just this. I think I describe it as a sort of that rare and radical bird, this kind of Hollywood film that places Black revolution front and center. It's also like a 1960s movie, like the kind of the energy, the momentum, and the kind of the sort of the radical vision, the idea that there's a radical future, that a sort of a radical emancipatory politics that we associate with the 60s is kind of infuses Burn, yeah. It's this kind of glorious celebration of 60s radicalism, Black power. Anti-Vietnam sentiment is also really important for the way in which we read or Pontecorvo's Burn. So eventually, after 20 years, I did eventually figure out what I wanted to say about that film.
Yeah, it is so, so interesting. And it does, stand in very stark contrast to something like 12 Years a Slave, which I think has a lot more in common with maybe like traditional Hollywood like race narratives in general. Like it has more to do with like the Green Book or Crash or something that's trying to tell sort of like feel good stories about race, and how individuals can kind of solve racism as opposed to systemic changes and things like that.
Yeah, so one kind of helpful. So I was talking to a colleague just a few months ago, actually, and he introduced me to this kind of term like wishful thinking. So one of the problems with 12 Years a Slave, he was saying, was it's yeah, guilty of wishful thinking. It wasn't like that, and it wishes that it was, if that makes sense. And and we can also think of some other recent Hollywood films that we might sort of position in a sort of similar field, if you like. Django Unchained, the Tarantino movie. That's a movie that really divided people, and arguably one of the things about Django that's unsatisfactory is that this the revenge that the kind of the two Black kind of main characters is a fantasy, a sort of historically fraudulent kind of wishful thinking fantasy kind of thing. But anyway, but Django is really complicated, I think. Django, yeah.
Very complicated. And I really liked your discussion too of Amistad and how that sort of changes historical narratives as well to sort of be about like the triumph of the legal system as opposed to anything else. Could you talk about that movie a little bit too?
Yeah, for sure. Amistad comes along at an interesting time. I think it's 1997. And what kind of the background to Amistad, or the sort of like the prehistory that I think is important, is that after the civil rights movement, it's no longer acceptable to make the kinds of slavery films that had been made before the civil rights movement. But how one makes a kind of a blockbuster movie for the multiplex about slavery is something that Hollywood studios really aren't very sure about at all. And there's this sort of, films, through the 70s and 80s, you still have films being made about slavery, but you really have this sort of relative silence, I suppose, or a quieter period where essentially because all of the kind of like the tropes and the kind of the traditions that were employed say in Gone with the Wind and the movies that followed in the wake of that. You can't do that anymore. And so basically Steven Spielberg is the guy that that Hollywood backs to pull this off. And so what comes at a few things come out of Amistad. First of all, the true hero of that film is the American legal system. But in order to kind of, communicate that message, the film has to do all sorts of things, like, for example, not contextualize or not think about other decisions that, say, the US Supreme Court made in, around about that time and not long after. So, Dred Scott, Plessy Ferguson, decisions that are made, not very many years after the Amistad decision. And really, Amistad is trying to say that, there's this sort of like, there's the formerly enslaved the enslaved Africans aboard the Amistad were really held to be free on a technicality. But the film seeks to tell a triumphalist sort of like morality tale essentially. And then I suppose another thing that's interesting about Amistad to me is it seemed to be easier for Spielberg to make a movie that showcased Africans rather than enslaved Africans in the Americas or in America. But the film's really not very curious at all about Africa itself. The other thing I would say is that the main character, Cinque, I think his name is, he's the way in which the film kind of portrays him. It's sort of like straight out of the kind of the late 18th, early 19th century abolitionist playbook. Cinque is this kind of like, beautiful, morally sort of, perfect kind of African prince. One of the interesting things about Amistad is that it really, it's all the silences, it's all the things that it avoids talking about. And then, of course, it was a failure. Spielberg famously said that his ambition with Amistad was to do for the African American experience what Schindler's List did for Jewish history. And on that, judging the film on that count or ambition, it was a failure. It seemed not to connect with audiences particularly. And then, of course, Spielberg made Lincoln, what, 2 decades afterwards, I think. I forget the year that Lincoln came out, about 2012, I think. And again, Lincoln, a little bit like Amistad, sort of, although even more than Amistad actually, avoids showing or talking about Black resistance. Black characters really don't even feature in Lincoln. If I remember rightly, there's sort of hesitant to say this while I'm being recorded, but I don't know if there are any like actual speaking parts for Black characters. It's been a while since I've seen that film. But anyway, so yeah, I guess like what Spielberg discovered, what the studios that back those films discovered, and the viewers as well, is that it's fraught. The relationship between filmmaking and race is Spielberg was trying to make films for a mass market, and I guess what I'm trying to say is that they hadn't really figured out how to go about that, and they still haven't, which comes back to the difficulty of getting a film about the Haitian Revolution made. Or we could think of, say, Nate Parker's 2015 The Birth of a Nation, film that was explicitly seeking to sort of overturn the legacy of Griffiths's 1915 The Birth of a Nation. So yeah.
That's so interesting because it seems like the Hollywood tradition or the traditional Hollywood tradition kind of veers between like white saviorism and like some sort of exploitation too, because I was thinking while you were talking about how Amistad and Django depict Black suffering, and how Django is sort of straight up, very openly wears it on its sleeve, like being exploitation. But like, I think some of the more prestige, if you want to call them movies, sort of can partake of that as well, and sort of how they then use that in their narratives. Um, yeah, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for talking to us about your book. What are you working on next? What are you researching right now?
So I've got a couple of things on the go. So I'm still working on the representation of slavery on film. I'm writing an essay on a Brazilian film called Vazante by Daniela Thomas, which I think is an extraordinary film, a recent film that I recommend to your listeners. And then I'm at the beginning of a new book project on something quite different, not about slavery, not about film. It's a book called Worlding Law and Literature, a materialist critique. So there's a subfield called law and literature. And in like a really brief nutshell, the kind of the history of that field is it's about using literary and cultural materials to think about, say, law, like legal concepts and jurisprudence and so forth. And then the other way of doing law and literature traditionally has been to bring the kind of the techniques of literary interpretation and literary theory to the interpretation of legal texts. And I'm sort of trying to make an intervention in that field. Yeah, and kind of worlding law and literature, the worlding of the title really means it's an argument for looking at literary, cultural, and legal materials from outside the global north.
Very interesting. Well, thank you again. It's been really great to talk to you, and I'm very excited for our patrons to read this and to check out these movies. I hope they have like a very nice long watch list now.
Me too. Thank you so much, Jen. It was lovely talking with you.
You too. Okay, listeners, please check out From Havana to Hollywood, Slave Resistance in the Cinematic Imaginary. Thank you so much for joining us. It's now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.